My name is Mike Naughton. I'm the director of the Center for Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas. I spent the last 25 years at that institution. I brought a handout, although I think it seems to have run out. But they say that there'll be a link to that, and we'll certainly get you that handout. I'll also have a PowerPoint, and if you want to have that as well, it certainly will be for yours for the taking. The handout that I actually provided, be quite frank, should have my wife's name on it, although she said she did not want me to put her name on that. But it's kind of practical kind of suggestions about what the Lord's Day, Sunday, can begin to look like. And if up on the screen, you'll see, and many of you know, that this is in many respects, this is a talk I've given. I just started giving this talk in the last couple months, and I like to put in honor of this talk Father Bill Bear. And many of you know Father Bill Bear. I actually taught Father Bill Bear in the seminary years ago, and he became a very good friend. And he also gave a wonderful talk at St. Olave's Catholic Church on the Lord's Day. I would recommend any of you, it's actually on the web, it's an audio, but he was a great man and also believed in this project very much. So as I mentioned, there are three things I would like to talk about this afternoon. One is, I think we got a problem. And here's the problem. We have deflated Sunday. There is a power to Sunday that we have unfortunately deflated. And I will not talk about all the ways that we do that, but I will talk about two of them, and I'll get to that in a moment. The second point I want to say is that you and I have to come to Sunday with habits. Habits that have a deep, intentional structure to it. Because if we don't come to Sunday with a deep, intentional structure to it, it will take over, the culture will take over, and again, we'll continue on to this problem of deflating Sunday. And thirdly, I'd like to talk about some concrete practices. The practices that I'll talk about doesn't mean that everyone has to do it. The question is not here to give you one particular formula about how you spend Sunday. Everyone has different situations, and you have to respond to it in light of those situations. But nonetheless, we have to respond to it in the right way. So first, the problem. We are here at St. Thomas Academy, and if St. Thomas Aquinas, the namesake of this institution, would come here to talk to you about the problem of Sunday, he would most likely quote his own project, which was called the Summa Theologica. And in the Summa, he says this. He says, Acedia is a sin against the Sabbath, against the soul resting in God. You probably don't know Latin. I don't know much of it. I just know enough things that, as Monsignor said, to say a few things here and there. But acedia is where we get, it's one of the 7 deadly sins. You know, pride, envy, lust, anger, and sloth. But how we understand sloth is very different than the way Aquinas understood sloth. When we think of sloth, we think of laziness, and we think of the couch potato. That's not how the medieval commentators understood it. They understood it not as physical laziness, but spiritual laziness. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about that. The problem we have is this problem of acedia. It is a sin against the Sabbath. It could be understood as restlessness. It could be understood as a deep refusal to be who we actually are. And again, there are multiple dimensions of it, but let me highlight 2. And the first one I'd like to highlight is this problem of careerism, of the overworked problem. There's a lot to be said about this, but let me tell you a story. And it's my story. I came to St. Thomas in 1981, and I made an unfortunate financial decision. I married my wife. Because she had the same amount of debt from college as I did. So we doubled our debt in marriage. But that was the only bad part of the marriage. It's been a great marriage, and I've been very blessed to have her as my wife. I also moved into a dilapidated house that needed a lot of work, new roof, basement, everything of that sort. I was also starting at St. Thomas. I needed to get tenure, and part of my condition of being hired at St. Thomas, I had started an MBA, and they asked me to finish it. And then we started this project at St. Thomas called Catholic Studies, which actually took a lot of work to get it off the ground. In order to do all that work, I had to do time management. And from 5 a.m. in the morning to 10 o'clock at night, and this is before the computer, before the phone, I would put out half-hour increments and fill them in order for me to accomplish everything I would able to do it. And I did it not 5 days a week, not 6 days a week. I did it 7 days a week. And I included Sunday as part of that work day, even though we did go to Mass and other things of that sort. Well, after about 8 or 9 years of this, the cracks started to show. And the first crack had to do with the family. Because we were so busy, we had 5 kids at that time, small kids, and all the things that went along with it, we started to smooth over all the particular problems because we didn't have time to talk about it. And I thought, by the way, I was a patient guy until I had kids. And that became another set of problems of dealing with my own anger and the own problems that went along with that. And then this other thing that kind of settled in, and it's actually coined by a Hungarian psychologist, Sandor Ferenczi. He said this. He talked about the idea of the Sunday neurotic, the Sunday blues. Why is it that often on Sunday, we would often have this sense of a lack of meaning, a disease, a sense of boredom, a sense of, not quite right? By the way, a lot of people would say, well, the reason why is because you have to go back to work on Monday. But actually, one reason is that Sunday is a day of rest, and yet we don't know how to rest. And by the end of the day, we get ourselves in knots, and thus produces the Sunday neurosis. And then the real kicker happened. In 1999, I was giving a talk in San Francisco, and I had a massive anxiety attack, a panic attack. And as I sat there ready to get on to stage, I thought, I can't do this. I can't talk. And by the time I could even think about heading out the door, the person introduced me, I walked up, and my breath went out of me. And I gave the worst talk of my life, because all I could do is almost catch my breath after one word, after the other word, after the other word. So I raise all that, and there's lots of issues. But what became very clear to me is that I was not living the Sabbath. I was not living the Lord's Day. And that things were starting to go wrong. And I think in many respects what happened is I had the power to work. But what Monsignor Richter told us this morning is that there's a power of the soul that is not about work, but it is about receiving. And if there's one thing we men often have a hard time doing, is receiving. And it is a power of the soul. Joseph Pieper calls it leisure, the attitude of the mind, the condition of the soul, to receive the reality of the world. And we too often spend a lot of our time fleeing that possibility. So the idea of overworked, working too much, and we do it in a lot of different ways, is certainly one set of problems. But I would want to say that there's another problem, and it's the problem of what we might call the having problem. The idea that we like to escape. We like to consume. And all too often in our time on the Sabbath, on the Lord's Day, we escape. Because we love to be entertained. I think often what is best captured is Billy Joel's song, right? They know it's been me they've been coming to see, to forget about life for a while. And too often our Sundays is often captured by that. By the way, the word amusement, entertainment, but amusement particularly, the word amusement, its etymologies are fascinating. It comes from the Greek word where you get the Greek word for muses. And the muses were the goddesses of the liberal arts, those arts that free us to see the fullness of reality and not simply a part of reality. But it's very interesting. You know that when you put the word in front of a word, it negates it. So if I'm a theist, I believe in God. If I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. Look under Wiktionary, the word amusement. Here's the definition: to stare stupidly at something. This is my wife's description of me watching television, right? I mean, this is often sometimes how we spend that particular day. And there's lots of different ways, but in many respects, our whole advertisement industry is often captured on this. This is a caption of a chain of hotels, the weekend getaway, where your body checks in and your mind checks out. And thus, the weekend is the time for escape. So we go to Las Vegas, and we think, of course, that whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? Well, whoever said that should be sued, because the only thing that stays in Vegas is your money. Everything else comes right back with you. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And this idea of escape on the weekend, of vegging out, right, has also had significant effect on the way we understand celebrations. Here we are now coming to St. Patrick's Day, just doing Mardi Gras. These days, which were meant to recreate us, have become days of great kind of gluttony. The commercialization of Christmas, the trivialization of Easter, the ghoulishness of Halloween. These were all holidays, holy days, days to help to see a larger reality. And yet they have become days that have been just simply frenetic forms of consumption. This has been the challenge of our culture, and it is sometimes the challenge of our own particular lives. And this is why I think one of the great people who really helps us to see this is John Paul II, because he wrote a document many years ago called Deus Domine, the Lord's Day. And this is what he says about this. He says, when Sunday loses its fundamental meaning and becomes merely part of a weekend, it can happen that people stay locked within a horizon so limited that they can no longer see the heavens. Hence, though ready to celebrate, they are really incapable of doing so. Right? There is something significantly at stake here. It's very interesting. One of the great French Enlightenment thinkers, his name was Voltaire in the 18th century, said if you want to abolish Sunday, if you want to abolish Christianity, abolish Sunday. But there's a man named Romano Guardini who says you can abolish things in a lot of different ways. By the way, the communists, the state of Albania abolished Sunday. They made it a work day. And that's often how the communists would often do damage to Christianity. But we, in a capitalistic, democratic society, have other ways in which we can abolish Sunday. And Guardini says this. He says, we can easily shove it aside. He says, work gnaws at it, right? We crowd it out, and we fill it up with all sorts of other things. And while we did not necessarily intend to destroy it, nonetheless, the fact is we have destroyed it. And we do this with overscheduled sports schedules. We have screens that never shut off, right? And we have lost the power of Sunday. Because here, and as I'll get to in a little bit, at the heart of Sunday are two things: deep rest, resting in the Lord, and not simply resting from something, but resting in the Lord, and also deep celebration. So with that said, I think we need to take a strong, hard look at our Sunday and what is at the center of it. And certainly in the Catholic tradition, it's worship. But there's a lot of things that are dealing with our Sunday. Family and friends, play, exercise, sport, nature, entertainment, amusement. The point is, by the way, of all of those is all of them are good. There's nothing wrong with entertainment. There's nothing wrong with watching a couple hours of football. 9 hours may be a little too much, right? Right? But all of this is, in a sense, we got to ask ourselves, what's at the center? And if you want to get at it, where do you spend your time? Do an audit. Be honest. And that will begin to tell you how you value what the Sunday's about. And so this idea of the Sabbath is pretty critical. I was telling somebody at the break, we often, of all the commandments, this is the one that we sometimes get a little casual with. I often think, what if I treated adultery like I treat Sabbath? Honey, I tried adultery this week. It didn't quite work. I'll try it next week, okay? Right? Marriage would not be around for very much longer. The Sabbath is one of the Big Ten. We got to take it seriously. So the question is, if we take it seriously, what does it look like? And so here I come to the thesis of my talk, which I briefly mentioned. But if we don't get Sunday right, we won't get Monday right. If we don't get rest right, we won't get work right. If we don't get receiving right, we won't get giving right. If we don't get the contemplative life right, we will never get the active life right. If we don't get our culture right, we won't get the economy and politics right. And if we don't get worship right, we will not get life right. I think there's a lot at stake here. The Lord's Day, Sunday, we are meant for it. We are built for it. And we have to be able to, in a sense, deal with it. So, when we speak about the Lord's Day, how shall we speak about it? Let me highlight a couple of things. Again, drawing upon John Paul II, here's what he says. He says, sharing in the Eucharist is the heart of Sunday, but the duty to keep Sunday holy cannot be reduced to this. In fact, the Lord's Day is lived well if it is marked from beginning to end by grateful and active remembrance of its God's saving power. John Paul knew very well that particularly we Catholics, we tend to think if we can get the obligation taken care of, the rest of the day is ours. If we have that attitude, we'll miss the point of keeping holy the Sabbath. And many of us find our way that sometimes the only thing we can do on a Sunday is to do the Lord's Day, or to do the Eucharist. And that's not a bad thing, but it's not the way you want to live it on a regular basis. And so the question is, what does Sunday look like, marked from beginning to end with this active remembrance of what God has done for us? And here, if I can put it this way, Pope Benedict had a wonderful way of putting it. He says, the most profoundest moment of our lives will not be what we've achieved. The most profoundest moment of our lives will be that which we've accepted. I saw this just recently. I was down at the University of Dallas giving a talk, and I had an old friend who's a teacher there, and he just retired from the faculty at the age of 60, because at the age of 57, he found he had Parkinson's, and it became very aggressive. And he was in the middle of writing a book. He was in the middle of teaching great classes. He was just a great scholar, and he had to give it all up. In many respects, at that point, you would think bitterness and resentment would animate the guy. But actually, deep love and acceptance occurred with him. His deepest moment, his greatest moment, was his ability to accept his, in a sense, sickness. That's why Sunday is a day of receptivity, because ultimately all of us are going to find ways that we have to receive things. So with that then is, how do you receive? And so here I want to talk about 3 habits. The first one is what we might call the personal habit, the habit of rest, of silence, of solitude. The second habit is the habit of celebration. And here it is this radical affirmation that the world is good. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And the third one is the habit of charity. So let me talk about each of these 3 habits. The habit of silence. The picture of this woman up here is actually in a monastery just south of Rome called Monte Cassino. And it's of the 4 Benedictine virtues. And she represents the virtue of obedience. And notice her hand. It's on her ear. To listen. To listen. I'm not quite sure about you guys, but my wife says, I don't listen. Right? I don't listen. And so this idea is, what happens is, the idea of silence and stillness is to let God work on us. There's no agenda. Monsignor talked about this. It's the idea that we have the ability to listen. And we need silence. And here's the challenge. Silence in here, not just out there. I don't know about you guys, but I got tapes going on in my head all the time. I am the unappreciated genius at St. Thomas. You know, if they would just listen to me, I would solve so many problems at this place, right? By the way, I walk to school. I'm about 2.25 miles away, and I have these debates with my colleagues in my head. By the way, I win every debate. I win them all, right? Right? I love Monsignor Richter when he said, the whiny little boy inside, right? Right? Shut the tape. We have to shut the tape, because if we don't shut this tape, nothing will come in. It will all be filtered through the tape, and it will all be disordered. Silence. And what does Jesus tell us, right? He says, come to me, all you who are labored and burdened, and I will give you rest. Because it's only in the silence that rest can begin to occur. And if we don't have silence on Sunday, it's going to be hard for us to have silence anywhere else. Sunday is one of the key days where silence and stillness should be able to take place. And here, 2 figures I want to read. One is a man named Joseph Pieper, who wrote a great book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture, a very famous German philosopher. And he said this, he says, unless we regain the art of silence and insight, the ability for non-activity, unless we substitute true leisure for our hectic amusements, we will destroy our culture and ourselves. Joseph Pieper wrote that in 1947. Right? And another great figure is a man named Romano Guardini. He says, we must earnestly desire stillness and be willing to give something for it. Then it will be ours. And once we have experienced it, we will be astounded that we were able to live without it. Because here's what silence does. It magnifies the heart. Because what often noise will do, it represses the heart. Silence magnifies it. And we start to get in touch with where it's at. But this silence is not quite enough. We need another habit, and it's the habit of celebration. Because here's one of the challenges. We live in a culture that's highly therapeutic. I would often call it spiritual individualism. We think we can do this all on our own, on our side, and we don't need to go to church. We don't need to celebrate with others, right? The problem with silence by itself is you just simply become a seeker without believing. You focus on spirituality, but not religion, as people say. But we need religion because we need others. And at the heart of faith is the idea of the feast day. This is what the Eucharist is about. And thus John Paul puts it this way. He says, for Christians, Sunday is the fundamental feast day established not only to mark the succession of time, but to reveal time's deepest meaning. When you think of time, think of 3 moments: origin, destiny, the present. For us to know who we are, we have to know where we've come from. And that's what Scripture reveals to us. We have to know where we're going, because we will all die, and we have 1 or 2 places we're going to. And once we begin to grapple with that, we begin to understand what this moment is today. And that picture that's up there is a picture that you would find in the Vatican Museum in one of the great rooms they call the Raphael rooms. And it is about the Eucharist. And it's about what people would call the sacramental imagination, which we have sometimes lost. When we think of imagination, we think of Disney. of escaping reality. But the Catholic tradition understands imagination is the image behind the physical reality. We have a physical reality, me. I am not just body parts. I am made in the image of God, right? What the Eucharist is always attempting to do is to provide the imagination that God is at work in this world, in every place that we go to. That's what celebration does. That this world is not of our making, but it's a making of God, which makes it radically good. And thirdly, the habit of fraternity. And here we have to look to John Paul on this because he says it so well. Here's what he says. He says, "From the Sunday Mass there flows a tide of charity destined to spread into the whole life of the faithful, beginning by inspiring the very way in which they live the rest of Sunday." And then he says, the faithful look around to find people who need their help. It may be that in their neighborhood or among those they know, there are sick people, elderly people, children of immigrants who precisely on Sundays feel more keenly their isolation, needs, and suffering. These few hours in voluntary work and acts of charity would certainly be ways of bringing people to the lives of the love of Christ being received. Right? That Sunday is often a day that we need to be mindful of those who are on the margins, who are those, and we go to them not for us to simply do things for them, which is, by the way, why the poor sometimes don't often have gratitude for us, because the attitude in which we go to causes the problem. We have to be with them. So these three attitudes, these three habits, are critical habits to entering into the Sabbath. This is how often the Jews will speak about it. We are entering into time, a different kind of time. And we have to have a different kind of heart as we enter into that. So then the question, of course, is what does all this look like? So part 3, and this is where the handout that I gave you, and again, we can put that on the web for those of you who did not get it. But let me highlight a couple things about what does this begin to practically look like. First is you've got to prepare for it. If you don't prepare for Sunday, it often doesn't happen. And it's really great if you have a good wife who can help, because I'm really bad at preparing. And my wife has been critical. She actually puts on her calendar on Wednesday, Sunday, just puts Sunday, and then takes a few minutes on Wednesday saying, what should we be doing about Sunday, right? Because what you do before Sunday really matters. We all know, by the way, and we've seen it, I don't think a lot of you are dealing with it, but if we're going out getting drunk on Saturday, Sunday is not going to be a kind of a real receptive time, right? But here's maybe another slightly interesting issue. A lot of us do things on Saturday that we should be doing on Sunday, and on Sunday that we should be doing on Saturday. We sometimes don't get those 2 days right. We sometimes take Saturday off and do all these particular fun things, and then we go to Mass on Sunday and realize we have to get all these other things done, and we turn it into another work day. It's the question about how we order things. How we order things. The picture that's up there is our kitchen table. And so on Sunday, often we sometimes do it the night before, sometimes it doesn't work, we'll do it Sunday morning. We have a runner, we have a little oil candle, we put a cross, we could put a journal, put whatever things, but we basically decorate the table that we know this is a different kind of day. So that's the kind of preparation. And there's certainly other things to talk about, but that would be one. This is the most difficult one, tech fast. By the way, I love this phrase, become a techno-Sabbatarian. Isn't that a great phrase? Become a techno-Sabbatarian. Try this. Turn off your screen for an hour. And if you can do it for an hour, try it for a morning. If you can't turn it off for an hour, there's a good chance that you have a particular disease that psychologists calls the internet anxiety disorder, right? It's very interesting. The way we're dealing with technology, let's be very clear, we cannot be anti-technological. I have the little devices. They were great devices. They now allow me to do so many different things. But there is a time, it's a tool. It's not a way of life. And that's what technology has become for a lot of people. Make it a tool. And a tool is something you could put away. This is why we also need to put production away, put work away. Don't shop. Make it a different kind of day. So the idea of tech fast. In your little booklets that I brought to you, second page, my wife and I, and largely my wife, adapted the Sabbath prayer, the Sunday prayer. And so when we wake up in the morning, we say this prayer together. I won't read the whole prayer, but the second paragraph of that prayer I find to be quite insightful. And it says this. And by the way, here's the thing. If you're going to make Sunday, you got to ritualize it. If you don't ritualize it, it slips away. That's protecting it. But the second paragraph, it says this. Let this day bring blessings of joy and peace to our hearts as workday thoughts and cares are put aside. Let the brightness of the Lord's day light shine forth to tell that the divine spirit of love abides within our home. In its light, may all our blessings be enriched, all our grief and trials softened. We are all burdened by particular things in life. And sometimes we just got to let it go. This is something I didn't always do well, but I try to. It's kind of like, just let the nagging go with the kids. Just let it go. Let it go for a day. Just drop it. It'll be there on Monday, right? It will be there, as my son back there will quite tell you is the case, right? The idea of a Sabbath walk, get out of the house. You got to get out of the house, right? My wife and I, sometimes, if we don't get out for the walk, things they just kind of creep in on you. They kind of implode. And in our walk, we actually have we never started this way, but we have a 4-mile walk. I know for some of you that may be too much, for some of you it's not at all. But in the walk, we do our talking, and then we actually take out a rosary and do a rosary. I hate to tell you this, but we do the Cliff's Note version of the rosary. We just do 5 Hail Marys, right? But we just do it because it actually fits the walk. It's a form of prayer, right? And it's a great time for things to come out in particular kinds of ways. Obviously, going to Mass is critical. In the handout, there's some things about understanding the Mass in that way. Having the feast, the brunch, is so critical, right? By the way, the feast, this is critical. We Americans actually don't do this very well. I hate to tell you this. Well, let me put it, this is what we used to do. We feed, we don't dine. I've lived 4 times in Italy. The Italians know how to dine. They take a long time. This is why they do courses. One thing at a, we throw everything on the damn plate and we eat the whole thing. And then we're done. Okay, what's next? The Italians think we're pigs, honestly, I hate to be so critical, but what they'll do is, and we don't do this, but you take one piece at a time. And that's why their dinners are 2 hours, 3 hours. And that's why ours are 20 minutes, right? Take your time with this. And lastly, or not lastly, but the question of games. Have fun. Have fun with the kids, right? Play games with them. It is of critical importance. And lastly, the question we've already talked about it is the question of charity, of volunteering when one can. For men, this is of critical importance to our calling. And here, our fundamental call is to receive. And that is at the heart of Sunday, that we receive. But also, we are also protectors. And we need to protect. And that's what a father is. The word patrimony is where we get the word father, but it is also the patrimony of those things that we protect. We need to see ourselves as protectors. And thus we need to help our wives, for those of us who are married, and protect Sunday. Because if we don't protect it, it will again be attacked and other things will start to kind of move into it. But also in terms of this, what does protecting Sunday do? It does a lot. And what I would like to say right now, it has protected my marriage. Because to be quite frank, every marriage has different problems. And they're never the same, but most of us all have problems. And it has been the idea of Sunday where we have had some of the biggest fights we've ever had in our lives because we had space to deal with things. Having the fight is not the problem. Suppressing it is the problem. And one of the biggest problems, I think, and I'm glad there are no women here so I can say this, but one of the challenges that many women have is resentment. And they have resentment toward us because we haven't dealt with it. Now, there's good reasons. We thought we dealt with it, right? And then it comes up again, and it comes up again, and it comes up again. I said, I thought we dealt with this. But no, we didn't deal with it. Or at least, we didn't deal with it the way I thought we dealt with it. And that's what often Sunday does. It creates space. It creates time. Because relationships take time. It also, it seems to me, protects our children, right? Here's one thing, my son is going to kill me, and he's back there, he's going to kill me on this one. Sorry, Eamon, right? But one of the things I wish I could have done, you always have your regrets, but I wish I would have spent more time dressing my children on Sunday. Just getting them to dress in a particular kind of way, protecting that particular day, getting rid of the technology, getting rid of the devices, right? How can we protect our children? And there's lots of different ways in which to do it, right? But there's a way that for us men, we can find ways in which to do it in different ways. And last, we need to protect worship, right? One of the big problems out there right now is this thing called nuns, those who have no religious affiliation. And most of them are men. Often it's the women who want to go to church, but sometimes it's the men. And obviously protect the fun, as we talked about it. So if we were to do an examine and to look at it, what would it begin to look like? And I throw these questions out to you. How do I, as a man, husband, father, son, reclaim the Lord's Day for my family? What challenges do I face, both interiorly and exteriorly? In what creative ways can I live out the commandment, keep holy the Sabbath, in light of my state of life? This ain't easy. This simply ain't easy. And yet, there are a lot of interesting people doing some really fascinating things. Particularly we as Catholics, we could do well looking at some of the evangelicals. I know there are several business people in here. It's interesting. Look at a Chick-fil-A and what they've done on Sunday. I mean, they have been an extraordinary witness. By the way, the dollars are amazing on Chick-fil-A. I read, don't quote me exactly, but it's close to this. The average Kentucky Fried Chicken that's open 7 days a week has revenue coming in at about $1.5 million. The average Chick-fil-A on 6 days a week has an average of $3.5 million a year. They've become very efficient, but also have been highly principled. A lot of times you can do both. So we need to find ways. We need to think through it. We need to be open to it. When opportunities come, we need to take advantage of it. So let me conclude. Again, I want to conclude with John Paul II. And this is what he says. He says, do not be afraid to give your time to Christ. The other speaker, I forget his name, who's speaking, he talked about the problem of fear. And I think for us men, at least it's been my issue. My wife will sometimes say, I'm afraid. And my first response is, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. But actually, you dig down a little deeper, and the fear is often there. I'll give you an example of this. I was giving a talk in Omaha if you're familiar with Legatus, it's a Catholic business group. And we started talking about this question of the Sabbath and the Lord's Day. And we're having a very good conversation. And this one guy raises his hand, and he was one of the owners of a company in Omaha. And he says, I kind of hear what you're saying, but I just can't do it. I go to Mass in the morning, I have brunch with my family, and then I'm back to work in the afternoon and working into the evening. And someone said, well, why don't you just try it? And he says, actually, I'm afraid of what would happen. I'm afraid of what would happen economically. I'm afraid of what would happen when I don't have control of these things. I'm afraid of what will happen when I let go of it. And it's what the kids often call, by the way, you can go back and give this acronym, FOMO, right? For those of you who know what it is, the fear of missing out. And I think that is sometimes our problem. It's the fear of not getting, the advancement, the fear of what people might say, right? It's the fear of whatever it is. And so that fear, and that's why John Paul started his whole papacy, be not afraid. Be not afraid. And so he goes on to say this. He says, the rediscovery of this day, Sunday, is a grace which we must implore, not only so that we may live the demands of faith to the full, but also that we may respond concretely to the deepest human yearnings. Time given to Christ is never time lost, but is rather time gained, so that our relationships and indeed our whole life may become more profoundly human. The Lord's Day is not an extrinsic demand upon us. The Lord's Day is helping us to be who we actually are. That disease I talked about, achadia, sloth, is the deep refusal of being who we are. The Lord's Day, when it's lived well, helps us to be who we are. Because at the end of the day, there are only two kinds of people. There are those who are resentful and those who are grateful. And those who are resentful often have this logic. Input leads to output, effort leads to reward, practice makes perfect, pursue your self-interest. And it's all kind of a quid pro quo. And here's why they're resentful. They're resentful because by the end of the day, they have seen certain people get more than they should, and they often think that may have gotten less than they should. And thus they end resentful. But when we have the capacity to receive, when we have received a deep sense that we have been given great things, we respond with great gratitude. And that is at the heart of the whole idea of the Sabbath, of the Lord's Day. This great capacity that we have been given so much. And it leaves us with a logic of gift, that God has given us so much. And thus, by giving us so much, we have much to give. This doesn't mean that we don't work at the end of the day. We work hard. We're called to protect, we're called to achieve, we're called to be builders. But we will disorder that if we don't have this great capacity to receive. I'll end with one historical note. I mentioned the man Joseph Pieper, a wonderful, profound philosopher. And he wrote a book I mentioned called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And actually the last chapter, he actually talks about the feast, the celebration, and the importance of the Lord's Day. But let me tell you something about that book. He wrote that book in 1947 in Germany. Think about it for a moment. Here's an academic. Germany's decimated, and he's talking about leisure? No, we got to rebuild. What do you that's stupid to talk about leisure. I got too much work to do. And here's what Pieper said. The reason why we got into such a totalitarian crisis, the reason why we elected such bad leaders, is because we kept on building and we didn't know what we were building for. And the only way you know what you're building for is by knowing what you received. And the fundamental day where that receptivity occurs, occurs on Sunday. So I really appreciate your attention, particularly in the afternoon. And God bless you all. Thank you.